the things that used to be most important to you, most important to a family, your mom, your dad, my in-laws, for example, when there's a change in health, when there's a change in ability, when there might be more of a sense of vulnerability or change in family roles, what I think both financial advisors and senior Americans have a hard time anticipating is priorities change. And they sometimes change in ways that we're not always currently aware of.
Welcome to Your Next Big Project is You, a podcast based around the theme of time. Time to be able to press pause on life. Time to reevaluate what's important. Time to reminisce about where you've come from, what you've learned, and what you've accomplished. Time to revisit your goals, dreams, and vision. And time to remember the people in your life. That's it, my friends. If you've got time, fasten your seatbelt and listen in as we discuss opportunities for the next 5 to 25 years of your life. And remember, your next big project is you. Well, welcome to our podcast. Your next big project is you. And I have a very special guest today, an old friend, someone I've been privileged to work with in the past. I believe this is Tom West's 28th year in business. So I know you got some insights, buddy. I know you got some insights to share here. Tom West, welcome to our podcast today.
Thank you. 28 years, I hope I have at least an observation or two, or was paying attention at least a little bit of it.
Well, for formal introduction, Tom, I believe people really privileged to listen to your thoughts today because I view you as one of the thought leaders in the wealth management industry today. Your charity, I know you're part of SEIA, Signature Estate and Investment Advisors. I know you've been with them since, I believe, 1997.
Right.
And we started your career in 95. And it's fascinating in terms of the lane that you have gone down, the pathway of your expertise of dealing with clients with transition issues and issues around aging and longevity. And I believe it's just important to share with people before we get into this. When I mention being a thought leader, I don't mention that lightly. I mean, you've been on senior housing and healthcare leadership positions. I know you've been quoted in the Wall Street Journal in the past, New York Times, Washington Post, Investment News. Need I go further? So I mean, that's enough for me and for people listening to want to listen into what your thoughts are. So thanks for joining us, and tell us a little bit more about that journey, Tom. And I want to talk more about some of those issues around aging and longevity and the transitions and those black swan events that you focus on. So how did things get going into where you ended up today?
Sure. Well, I mean, the background story, I think, sets the stage for your podcast listeners. So I came into the financial services industry kind of kicking and screaming. This wasn't the career that I had trained for. Effectively, I got engaged and married at a very young age, coming out in the job market in the 90s. And I couldn't find the job that I wanted. The job that I took was long-term care insurance with John Hancock Mutual Life Insurance Company back in the day. And, you know, it was a tough job, Leo. It was cold calling. It was trying to find 60, 70 somethings to be planning ahead. And it was a challenge where my observations are, one, it was a tough job. Boiler room cold calling is tough. But two, I was really good at it. Didn't mean that I enjoyed it. One of the things early that I discovered about myself was, you know, the idea of zeroing on hopes and things people are wishing for, and the idea of expressing your values and decisions you make about things like insurance was absolutely where I gravitated towards as compared to fear-based selling early in my career, sort of a natural piece. But the background professionally really came with all the families that I was introduced to in the early 90s that really didn't know what long-term care insurance was about. And I was being invited into homes of folks that had some chronic illness or disability already diagnosed. I was meeting a lot of families in my early 20s with dementia, with multiple sclerosis and things like that, that weren't going to be eligible for long-term care insurance. And I had what amounts to be, Leo, this is back when, you know, a little bit after you and I met, what amounted to be some situational awareness of one, if long-term care insurance wasn't a solution for people that were uninsurable, or what really is, these were people that had too much money for Medicaid. And two, there didn't seem to be anybody in financial services that were real interested in helping them for a number of reasons: compensation, changes in the household decision making structure, and whatnot. But really, the genesis of my career in wealth management started from sort of a diagnosis and a prescription. What can families benefit from with improved decision making when they're in a time of crisis, when their priorities are changing, when they have to be much more sensitive to changes in health? How can I maybe build my specialization where it started from insurance and moved into financial planning and broader wealth management? That's really been sort of an underpinning of how I got here today. But that genesis with the insurance and seeing all those folks that perhaps needed some different kinds of professional support, that's really what got me started.
Wow. Well, let's humanize this a little bit further. You and I have gotten to know each other over the past decade or so.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking about my own situation. I own long term care insurance,
Mhm.
myself and my wife. And I always tell people it's the worst insurance bill I get because I don't ever want to live in assisted care. I've
Sure.
lost both my parents. My wife has lost both of her parents. I live very closely watching dementia and Alzheimer's take place with my father in law, with Parkinson's, with my mother in law, with congestive heart failure, with my mom. I've been in assisted care facilities, skilled nursing. I've been there and said, man, I do not want to end up here.
Right.
I don't want to end up here. But my own wealth planner, like yourself, Tom, very skilled, guiding me relative to protecting myself and my wife and my family, now with 4 kids and soon to be 7 grandchildren.
Mhm.
This is an insurance that I needed to get my hands around.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so, I mean, talking to people, there's got to be a lot of people out there like me that have lived and seen parents age, dealing with health issues. My father would have turned over Tom in his grave, knowing that my mother, dealing with her heart issues in skilled nursing, $9,500 a month. And this was over 10 years ago.
Right. Right.
People from there to Strong Memorial Hospital in Rochester, New York, back to skilled nursing, back to assisted care, back. I'm this cycle repeating itself. So you got involved in this in helping people, but it seems like your approach, because it's so much more robust wealth management, and the point of that, I think you call it when you and I talked about, there's like an advice triage. There's
Right.
the point
Right.
where the rug gets pulled out from underneath you. Talk about that moment when those emotions and that reality of health issues in wealth management starts to intersect and where
Yeah.
your expertise comes into play. Let's talk about that for folks.
Sure. And I mean, Leo, we've talked about your family story and mine. We certainly, Beth and I, my wife, had personal caregiving where you learn lessons that, living through it, you really can't find somewhere else. I think that it's jumping off of those personal experiences. It makes sort of this next point that I'm making a little bit more accessible. The things that used to be most important to you, most important to a family, your mom, your dad, my in-laws, for example, when there's a change in health, when there's a change in ability, when there might be more of a sense of vulnerability, or change in family roles, what I think for both financial advisors and senior Americans have a hard time anticipating is priorities change, and they sometimes change in ways that we're not always currently aware of. So, like, imagine, I had a client. Her name was Tanya. Her husband had dementia and was an accountant. And their most important thing was to hand off his CPA business to one of their children, and to simultaneously have a well funded retirement with a lot of travel. When he started exhibiting symptoms of dementia, their most important things changed dramatically. It turned out that there were a number of financial decisions that they had made along the way that were impacted by the disease itself, and they were in a lot more financially vulnerable of a situation than they ever thought. So the priority went from transition to business and, finance of retirement, to playing defense and how are we going to be able to afford stuff. Then they changed a few more times as well. For this particular family, it then turned into, I want to be taken care of at home no matter what. I never want to go anywhere else. But maybe that wasn't clinically appropriate. Maybe that wasn't someplace where our husband could feel safe. And then the new priority was, we want to stay together no matter what. And then a priority after that was really, okay, past a certain point with the progression of the disease, we really need to manage a thoughtful, a well intentioned, a dignified dying process. And when I say the most important things, here's sort of the takeaway, Leo. When I say the most important things, it didn't matter how much it cost. When we want to stay home no matter what, it was not a financial decision. It was a life, family, marital decision. And what I've learned as a financial advisor is when there's shifts, a lot of time driven by changes in health circumstances, imagine that it trumps a lot of the goals that financial advisors like myself had previously been pointing all of the investment strategy and tax strategy towards, the goal that is no longer the new priority. And I think that the place that I've really tried to explore in some of the thought leadership that you described was, how do we in the financial advice field develop a better set of skills that we can track the changing priorities and get to where our clients really are, and to be able to more dynamically bring some of our skills and our resources and our talents to bear to be able to get them better outcomes at whatever their new location is along their storyline. That's a
Yeah.
lot of this thought about priorities.
Well, from personal experience, Tom, it can happen like in an instant.
Mhm.
I mean, it happens quickly. It could come out of nowhere.
Right.
I mean, I'm in Palm Coast, Florida, and I'm with my father-in-law, who looks at me years ago and says, "I'm going to the post office and I'm forgetting how to get home."
Mhm.
I mean, right there, life changed. That simple conversation of going to hit a few golf balls with my father-in-law,
Mhm.
with that openness and his vulnerability, his in his feeling like my life has changed and I don't know what to do.
Right.
So Tom, how do we help people to deal with the stuff before it happens? Because
Yeah. Well,
people don't want to talk about dying. People don't want to talk about getting disabled and getting sick, or am I going to be buried, or am I going to be, you know, dealing with my remains in a different way? I mean, come on.
sure.
How do we begin these sensitive discussions? What stage?
Sure. Well, I think that I'm glad that you asked it in a timing question, because imagine, the best practices that we see in not just our industry and our professional discipline, but in, medicine and law. The best thing to do is to pre-solve all of these problems beforehand and to have your insurances and your legal documents, and you've already had your conversation with your kids. And imagine that that's really only 20-30% of the population are those kinds of planners. And a lot of them were the ones that bought my long-term care insurance a long time ago. A lot of them are the ones that move into life plan communities if they can afford it, so on and so forth. And I think for that population, the way you answer the question, how do you mitigate it, is you scenario build. What about best case? What about worst case? And you sort of breadcrumb. What are the different sets of decisions that we might make in advance? Because we certainly don't want to start thinking about this stuff for the first time in an emergency room. Leo, there's the big middle though, and we call the big middle the procrastinators. And the
Mm.
procrastinators are folks that like, look, I know exactly what the issues are. All right. And I know that I have not had this conversation with my kid, and my will is sort of half done. And I have this bejangly looking business interest over here that I never got around to doing. And I'm kind of managing this health thing over here. So when there's news about sort of a change in status or decision making or circumstance or whatnot, imagine there's immediately oh, I shoulda, woulda, coulda, shoulda. And I don't have all my ducks in a row. And how do you serve families in that circumstance? It usually has to do with two things that are important. The first one is, I think that you always want to start from a place of hope. The idea of, given what you know now, Leo, my friend who just came up with this crummy diagnosis, I'm serving you. Given what you know now, like right now, what are the things that you're most hopeful for? What are you most hopeful for yourself? What are you most hopeful for you and your wife, for your kids, your grandkids, and whatnot? And it's extremely important to zero in on the new vision of the things that you're hopeful for and start building around that, as compared to, Leo, what are you really worried about? What's the thing that you never want to have happen? How bad could it get? Like, the reason that you don't want to zero in on that is there's an enormous amount of research in psychology that says fear-based decision making isn't effective. It kind of collapses on itself. It's something that you keep digging a hole down. Hope has a distinct concept, engages different parts of the brain, and you get more easily past like the parts of the brain that are impacted by fear and anxiety, where your analytical function sort of shuts down. By zeroing in on things that you're hopeful for, you think forward, you're more imaginative. That's how you do it. What you do is going to be dependent a lot on two things. One, which is what exactly is your health circumstance? And realistically, what would be prescribed in terms of a plan for you and what your circumstance is? And if it's a mobility issue, are there things that can be done to the home, or do you need to move? But you start driving your forward look based on where a particular medical condition might take you. And that's going to vary. The Parkinson's story is going to be different than the dementia story, which is going to be different than a mobility story. So you want to be sensitive to that medical starting point that you're looking at. I always want to sort of zero in on this last piece, which is the idea of acceptance. And this isn't just for financial advisors. This is for you and me and our listeners who are just plain old human beings. And the idea of acceptance, when things change and our priorities change and our abilities change, acceptance really means being able to look at something the way it is and to be able to say, that's the way it is. It's not the same as surrender or giving up, or like, it's not any of those things. It's just being able to assess reality and being able to use that as a jumping off point for future decisions. And that might be an area for family members or clergy or professionals like financial advisors to help our clients kind of accept and define the reality that they're in right now. That's sort of part of the how for that big middle of procrastinators. And Leo, there's one last group, which we haven't talked about. Remember, planners, procrastinators. Who's the last group? The last group are crashers. The last group are the ones that are not watching this podcast, the ones that don't have really anything done. And these are personalities that we all know in our lives that, for better or worse, crash into the system, have an expectation that something or somebody is going to rescue them. And they end up getting the worst outcomes, and somebody has to come in and pick up the pieces. So often it's spouses, adult children. There's this whole group of attended professionals that try to pick up pieces and whatnot. But I mean, it should just sound like common sense. Crashers put an enormous strain on the system, and we all have to react to the resources that they take up, whether you're a planner or a procrastinator along the way. And I've learned, somewhat cynically, but realistically, there's no talking to crashers. They're just going to crash, and you got to just manage them after the fact. So really, the place that I really like to impact is this procrastinator group in the middle, because they're almost there, they're sensitive, and how can we drive better calls to action to get them better outcomes if we can zero in on things that they're hopeful for?
Tom, if I had 10 of my best friends over back of my shoulder listening to this, my guess, if one of the 10 had their act together relative to the health integrative issues around wealth planning, what's surprising, you talk about this big middle. My sense, it's bigger than what we think.
Yeah.
That most people do procrastinate. When you mentioned hope, to me, there was an author that wrote a book, Hope is Not a Strategy, right? And so I know you have ways of discussing hopeful about living. I want to live till I'm hoping to live till I'm 100, right?
Right.
Most of us would say things like this.
Sure.
But what you said there is acceptance in dealing with reality. Okay, here's where I'm at. Here's the gap between the next 32 years, let's say, to get there.
Right.
Now let's discuss the real issues of health, to accept where we're at, the behaviors that we need to think and adjust over the next decade or so. And
Right.
around those issues, of assisted care, long-term care, and other
Sure.
health integrative issues that we need to think about.
Yeah,
So
I think that's right.
here's the issue. Here's the question for you.
Mhm.
Our industry doesn't teach people to give them the skills
No,
where you become a thought partner in. You've worked your
no,
rear end off for a quarter of a century to establish a mindset of proper strategic thinking
mhm.
that gives you a mentality of what the real issues are. Most people come into this industry, we're Series 7,
Yep,
65,
yep.
all these terms that investors are clueless on what that really means, but they're taught how to just go get the money.
Right,
And
right.
let's figure out how to add the assets under management to
Sure.
my reputation. But where you're going and where you're at is a total different value proposition, buddy.
Yeah, no, thank you. And by the way, you're if you really zero in on, hey, is it accurate to say, can we accept that the financial services industry is pretty terrible in this particular space? I think so. I mean, most of us that have a degree of professional success usually come from a base set of skills and talents around either salesmanship or quantitative analytics. All right. The idea of like social worky type stuff that's not in a lot of our professional background really at all. I think the other piece too is I don't think we have compensation structures or business models that really help. There's a group there's a group of our viewers in the financial services industry. The moment we started on long-term care stuff and the touchy-feely things about old and those sorts of things, there's immediately a group that's like, "Oh, this is just not for me." I would here's something to think about, financial service professionals. If there is a predictable chapter in your client's life where everything changes and the sets of priorities are not like what they used to be, and the people that know them and can establish trust and rapport and value in that particular chapter, they end up not just being advisors for life, but really white knight hero types. When you think about the changes in health and the attendant changes in priorities, and I'm speaking to financial advisors, a lot of this is my effort to try to turn back to my own industry to try to elevate the standard of care that we take. Think of what are the two things that American seniors are most worried about? They're most worried about losing independence and being a burden on somebody else. And if you zero in on the exact time frame where things are changing, where ostensibly a lot of our professional discipline trains us ahead for good investment strategies or tax strategies or whatnot, but we are absent values and skills in the exact moment that folks have the most concern about, I think that that's sort of a failure of industry. But it's also an opportunity, Leo, because think of if we can just suck less at this particular space, if we can develop some skills. I'll give you a few sort of pointers. The first one is when there's a plan of care that is written, okay, everybody in the family is in the room. Everybody wants to know, listen, if dad can't come home, what are we going to do? And who's going to be responsible for what? Because before somebody's a lot of times discharged, there has to be some agreement somewhere about what happens next. So at the point that a family's new reality is being defined by a plan of care, imagine all of the different decision makers are around the table. That specifically is a place for us as financial advisors to find a way to be present in those particular conversations. Not that we're the doctors or the nurses or have an impact on the plan of care, but we want to be sensitive to your new sets of priorities are changing. And based on what plan of care is prescribed, we need to have all of the financial decisions that we make that needs to be responsive to the new reality that we're in. Your hopes and new circumstances right now, that's the dog. The financial decisions that we make, that's the tail. And we should have, as a discipline, as financial advisors, a seat at the definition of this new reality for families so that we can more properly make adjustments on all of the things that we're trained to do with taxes, with liquidity, with investments, with insurance, and so on. But too often, we just take a step back and wait. We say, this isn't really something that I'm comfortable with. I like talking about investment returns and aggregating money and taxes and that sort of stuff. But this touchy feely stuff, that's not really what we do. Well, I'll share with you if you think about what are the roles that we play in our families' lives that can really never be substituted by a computer or can't be readily scaled by 800 numbers. It's being present and adding value at inflection points of our clients' lives. And I think that we as an industry just have a blind spot on this one area where we can make a huge impact and find clients for life. Even if there's one other sort of quick cynical point that I'll make, sometimes people don't want to zero in on this, Leo, because somebody's probably going to die soon. And the idea, why am I putting all of this effort in where we might only be looking at a household longevity of a short period of time? I think that we're always looking for ways that we can increase wallet share across a larger group of folks. If you're able to serve somebody in those kinds of vulnerable transitions, the way that you present your service model to a spouse, to extended family is something unlike any other way that we might differentiate in the market. So there's a handful of different thoughts in there, but I'm glad you prompted me that way.
Tom, when is the right time though? Before the rug falls out or comes out underneath you? When you find out you got the health diagnosis, you just found out you got cancer or some disease or some illness, or now you're on the clock? Because most people don't want to talk about it. So you talk about getting the kids together.
Mhm.
At what stage? Because the spouse or significant other, like, I don't want to talk about this stuff. Come on,
Sure.
you're healthy, you're doing great. You say, you know what? There's a point where we need to call a timeout.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that families don't want to call a timeout, Tom. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
it sounds great, but it usually the timeout doesn't come until the advice triage. All of a sudden you found out,
Yeah.
hey, dad or mom are in trouble. We got to
Sure.
deal with this. And guess what? Our hand is now forced. The deck of cards. It's like, you got to turn
Sure.
this card over now. We got to deal with this right now. Where before we didn't even want to turn them over, but now this has been turned over for us.
Yeah.
So, so how do you advise a healthy person, a healthy family with kids,
Yeah.
and to put your fist down to say, you have to do this now. It's almost
Yep.
like an exclamation point, that a moment where you put the stake in the sand,
Mhm.
Tom, because I don't think people want to put the stake in the sand until the rug gets pulled out.
Yeah. By the way, thank you for putting a thumb right on a pressure point with all of this. And I know the audience appreciated that question. So I'll take it sort of two different ways. The first one is an acknowledgement that you're absolutely right. Listen, if I'm in the middle of getting discharged from a hospital and I need to get a hospital bed and rework my transportation, and the last thing I need is to talk about to my financial advisor right now because there's stuff that's on fire. As soon as that fire basically gets put out, you're right. The instinct of everybody around is to try to retreat back to the rest of their lives, to try to establish more control and normalcy. You're exactly right. There's a space in there. Sometimes it's hard to see, but it's basically once a new reality is acknowledged, once there is recognition that the status quo can no longer be maintained. But I'll tell you what I've done in my practice, which is really tries to zero in on that. You'll recall that I developed and I trademarked a particular financial planning offer called the Life Care Affordability Plan that was a single fee plan that I basically hired professionals from the senior housing and healthcare industry to help define what those plans of care might look like and making sure that we're very clinically and therapeutically versed in what the family's really reacting to. So the first part, Leo, is the place that the advisor really wants to come in and talk about. It isn't the money stuff. It's an acknowledgement and a recognition of the new priorities and the new health circumstance. Like that's where the family's mind is. And you need to go to where the family is, which is what do we really need to understand about the plan of care? What do we need to understand about new roles and responsibilities in the family? What do we need to understand about the ability or lessened ability of a particular client? And you stay there and you make sure that you're understood as a trusted listener, an empath in that place before you start as you said, violently staking your claim into shifting some of the other pieces. You have to meet your client where they are. And the effort that I made was trying to make sure that we were able to add some value, where we had some professional expertise that came out of hospice and assisted living and life plan communities and so on, so that as an extension of our practice and our value proposition, when she's in the room, she belongs there. She knows who the service providers are. She knows, can help with, making connections inside of different service models and whatnot. And it's once you establish with the family a familiarity in that very sensitive space, decision making space, that's when you find appropriate and selective opportunities to be able to expand into some of the financial stuff. The second thing, other than speaking healthcare and being present in that part of the conversation, Leo, the second thing is you start with letting your calendar be the guide. Okay. If we're coming up at the end of the year, then we really need to zero in on how much did we actually spend out of pocket on medical expenses, because we have to account for a deduction. And that deduction might mean we accelerate more money out of distributions out of our IRA, or maybe it mitigates some capital gains, or maybe it should change tax withholding on January 1 of next year, but you let the calendar be the guide. Okay. Following year, listen, we got to file. Maybe there's insurance deadlines or deductible periods that you have to zero in on. But if a financial advisor is paying attention to the world that is calendared associated with that discipline, you should be able to find appropriate places to start building on concepts, so that eventually you have the opportunity to come back and say, listen, we probably need to look at this holistically. The plan of care, the new family priorities, that's the dog. Let's rethink the way that we're doing money, liquidity, taxes, investment, and so on from there. But you're exactly right. You can't do it violently, and that's not an immediate impulse on the part of a lot of families. That's how we've tried to improve the way in there, because that's a huge sensitivity.
I believe one of my takeaways from talking to you again, Tom, is that how our industry talks about as a wealth management specialist, a financial planner, an investment advisor, whatever, in integrating with a client's accountant or their trust and estate attorney, that we need to add another area of health integration, whether it's the doctor or whether there's discussions around health and how health integrates with wealth planning. And whether it's in an intersection of your heart and your head, or that intuition, client to client, as it's customized, and to say, we've been working together for the last 20 years and we're starting to reach a point where we need to be more sensitive to the integration of the reality, hoping what you're hoping to do in the next couple of decades, as well as the reality intersection of where we're at, how this comes in for longevity in our planning going forward. There's some sensitive issues that maybe we needed to raise the volume on a little bit more. So here's the final question for us, because I could talk to you all day. We may need to do another podcast, because I think we're getting into some really meaty discussion points right now. And it's this: people who are aging, like myself, right?
Like me.
So we're aging, right? And as we're aging, the issues of health and wealth planning are becoming more and more, appropriate on my desk every day, right? But at the same time we're aging, our primary wealth partners are aging as well. And they're dealing with the same aging and health issues that you and I, or the listeners listening into this podcast, they are dealing with themselves. Right. And you got the wealth industry aging, and you got the wealth industry wondering about their succession and exit strategies. How am I going to leave my $500 million of assets, or $1 billion, or 100 million, whatever the number is?
Right.
How am I going to get paid in transition into my 70s and 80s? And guess what? I'm getting health issues, and my clients are. But you know what? I'm leaving when my clients need me the most.
Right. That's a you problem.
How do we reconcile this, Tom?
Boy, I mean, I think that what a great question, Leo. I think first, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? That's the first thing that I would probably say. But look, what a great perspective. What's the average financial advisor? They're what, in their late 50s, and we as an industry are not replenishing sort of the appropriate talent, and whatnot. And the business models are changing. I think I think that we do the Wayne Gretzky attitude and think about skating to where the puck is. The market wants this. The market wants there to be consistent value, particularly for those of us in the industry that are paid a retainer to help make optimized financial decisions under a variety of different life circumstances. I think that there is a space, particularly with the boomers moving through this particular age band, that creates a historically unprecedented opportunity for those of us in the industry that have the foresight to be able to rethink their business models. I think that some of the people that we're talking to maybe aren't those 50 something financial advisors. Maybe they're the 30, 40, and 50 somethings. Because also somebody's going to be left with an enormous opportunity. And I think that the market is going to require a more diverse set of skills, communication skills and empathetic skills in particular around those behaviors. These are the things, Leo, that you've preached the gospel, and that's stuff that really matters. The
Yeah.
value ladder, those particular pieces of time, talent, treasure. You're part of the message that I think is going to make a difference in finding a solution to your question, which is we got to focus with our clients on the most important things and maybe the new most important things. Consider, here's my last point. Consider that something like 70% of senior Americans change financial advisors at the death or disability of the first spouse. And we know generationally speaking, it's something like 90 to 95%. There was a Vanguard study of money goes out the door when one generation passes to the other. Well, here's the observation. They're going somewhere, right? And if you can find a way to introduce a new value proposition at a time of vulnerable inflection for the family, my experience is you get the assets and you get the kids' assets and you retain family money intergenerationally because, of course, you would. You help two generations at the same time drive better outcomes during a period where, just like Leo said, this isn't an area that a lot of financial advisors really want to get involved in. Let's think about this from a strategic standpoint. It's like the demographics are giving us a bullseye, like help right here, and you might be able to unlock retention of assets and households in ways that you haven't looked at before. That's, I think, the right attitude to address that question.
Well, I believe our conversation is just beginning when we have to end. This is really, really an important discussion. I don't know why. I'm a movie buff, right?
Mhm.
And I'm thinking of you. Don't ask me why. And you and I have spoken numerous times over
Sure.
the years. But I keep thinking of one of my old Christmas favorites, It's a Wonderful Life.
Mhm.
When Jimmy Stewart is trying to realize the gifts in his life, his family and his friends, and
Mhm.
trying to find us out. And was it Clarence out of that angel?
Clarence, right? Angel
was
got
like,
wings.
Clarence, help me, Clarence. Help
Mhm.
me, Clarence. Help me, Clarence. Right. And to me, it's like, help me, Tom. Help me, Tom. Help me, Tom. And there's this feeling that I have is the industry needs more Tom West. They need more people like yourself, Tom, that are committed to this cause of helping people through these significant and important decisions that we're all going to be facing. It's not just the discussions of asset allocation and diversification and returns and things like this. It's the issues around the correct return on our life going forward, of the integration of our values and our families and dealing with very difficult, complicated, sensitive issues. So I leave this podcast knowing that another minute has gone by, or another hour will go by, and another month will go by, another quarter will go by, another year will go by. And we need people like you to call those lifetime outs at the right time, the right place, with the empathy, the compassion, and the care that you bring is one of the the best thought leaders in our industry. So thank you for joining me today. I hope
Well, I
you can
appreciate
connect
that very
sometime,
much. Thank you.
talk more about this. And Tom West, you're a real gift to the industry. And thanks for all that you do in making, and I know you're going to be providing more thought leadership to advisors
Sure.
on helping them to shift. So it's beyond just the clients that you've been privileged to serve. You're going to be doing a lot more for the industry in the coming years as well. So thank you for your contributions.
Thank you. And thanks for letting me add my voice. Bye bye, Leo.
Thank you, buddy.